PMDD shaped my life for 17 years before I could name it. I spent those years searching for answers, questioning my sanity, and desperately seeking treatments that actually worked. My painful journey had an unexpected twist. Helping others heal from PMDD became my life's purpose. Hi, I'm Jess, a board-certified nutritional therapist, coach, the founder of Her Mood Mentor, and your host. This is PMDD Pep Talk, a weekly reminder that your suffering is real, your experience is valid, and your future is brighter than your symptoms suggest. Each week, we're going to explore the truths about PMDD that nobody talks about. The kind of truths that shift something deep inside you and make you think, maybe there's more possible than I imagined. Whether you're in the depths of luteal darkness or riding the clarity of your follicular phase, you're exactly where you need to be. Because here's what I know for sure. Healing PMDD isn't just about managing symptoms, it's about transforming your life. This challenge, as brutal as it can be, is an invitation to know yourself more deeply and live a more joyful, purpose-filled life. PMDD might feel like your whole story, but it's just a chapter, and you get to write what comes next. Welcome to PMDD Pep Talk. Quick pep talk pause. Remember that everything we talk about here is meant to educate and inspire. Always team up with your healthcare provider for personal medical advice. All right, now let's get into it. Hello, and welcome back to the PMDD Pep Talk podcast. This is another conversation that I've been wanting to have with you for a while. Every time someone follows us on Instagram, we ask them, what symptoms are you experiencing? What's the hardest part for you? And I can't tell you how many times women say, the time that I've lost, or so much of my life that I've lost to these symptoms. And that's so real. That's so real. And yes, this is the PMDD Pep Talk podcast. So we are going to flip this and we are going to hold space for the nuance of truth that is the grief, but is also the hope. But we have to call it out here. We have to have the conversation. So thanks for sticking in it with me here today. This is really for those of you who have felt like everyone else got a head start on life, who feel kind of stunted in life due to undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, poorly managed symptoms that got in the way of you living the life that you've wanted. If you feel like there was a version of your life that was supposed to happen, the confident you, the strong, healthy relationships, the career advancements, the financial security, the sense of knowing yourself, but it got lost somewhere along the way. You just missed it. This is also for those of you who've watched other people hit milestones and you couldn't figure out why you kept falling behind. You probably told yourself that you were lazy or too difficult or too emotional or just not cut out for the things that you actually wanted. And most commonly what I hear is women telling themselves that something is just wrong with them. Something is just wrong with you. Maybe you've told yourself that. But by the end of this episode, you're going to know something. You're going to know that if you've spent decades feeling behind, lazy, difficult, too much, that it was not a character flaw. There is research finally putting numbers to what those of us experiencing PMDD have been living through. And today we're going to look at those numbers and we're going to talk about what you can still reclaim. So here's the first number I want you to hold on to. A 2020 study published in BMC Women's Health found that women with PMDD wait an average of 20 years between the onset of their symptoms and an accurate diagnosis. You heard me correctly. I said 20 years. The researchers literally titled one of the themes in that paper, Misdiagnosis and the Lost Decades. Their participants reported their symptoms starting around age 15 and then reported being correctly diagnosed around age 35. So if you've been in this for a long time and you've spent most of it, not knowing what was happening with you and your symptoms, you are probably going to feel behind in life. And that totally makes sense because you were inside a 20-year diagnostic gap that the research itself is finally naming. When that study came out, when I found that study, I was just had to take some breaths, had to screenshot it, had to share it in stories with all of you on Instagram because I was just, we've had research like that before, but it was about half the amount of time. And this feels so much more true based on the thousands of women that we've talked to and supported over the years with PMDD. And this conversation that we're having today, this is what happens when PMDD starts in adolescence. And when it starts in adolescence and those symptoms onset when you're a teenager, your life probably looked a lot like weeks of the month that you lost that you couldn't explain. Those weeks just felt unsurvivable. This is why you missed school and it didn't add up because you were bright and capable, but still you were somehow falling behind. It also looks like relationships in your teens and 20s that kept breaking down cyclically. Maybe you didn't recognize the pattern at the time, but the saying hindsight is 20/20 is for a reason, and maybe you can see it now, right? You saw those relationships probably breaking up 2 weeks before you got your period each cycle, but you couldn't explain why, and your partners called you unstable or crazy, and your friends, they just stopped inviting you places because they never knew which version of you would show up. It also looks like career opportunities you didn't take because you couldn't trust yourself to follow through, or you couldn't even get to the point of being offered the opportunity. It looks like jobs that you lost or left. It looks like moments where something good was within reach and then the luteal phase hit at exactly the wrong time, and you watched those opportunities go out the window. It's also going to look like milestones that got delayed or skipped entirely, whether they be educational, financial, relationships, just general stability in life. The things that really stack onto each other, and then, you're not getting that stack because your foundation gets pulled out from under you every 2 weeks. Your foundation of focus, your foundation of stable moods, your foundation of motivation, your foundation of energy, right? When that's knocked out on repeat for 2 weeks, up to 2 weeks, every single cycle, you really can't make the progress in your life that you see your friends, your family, your colleagues making. And the most painful part of that is that these experiences are often internalized as a character flaw. But what's actually happening is undiagnosed, misdiagnosed, or mismanaged PMDD symptoms in full presentation. And this is what happens when a serious hormonal mood condition, or as I like to say, experience, goes unrecognized through the years that you were supposed to be building your life. The cost is really real, okay? The lost years are really real. And I hear many women experiencing PMDD talk about it every day, but I hear very few practitioners diving into the topic. And this is something that I have faced myself. Just a few weeks ago, I did a story series on Instagram about how I just feel stunted in life. I feel behind in my career. I felt behind in my relationships for a really long time. In other ways, I still feel behind in my relationships. I felt behind in so many of the aspects of adulthood because I didn't feel like I could be an adult. I didn't feel like I could function consistently the way that I saw other people. And I also want to name here, for so long, I really was like, I must just not be trying hard enough, right? When I was still in my late 20s, I would see people graduating with their doctorate degrees, buying homes, starting to have kids, buying cars, like all these things that I just couldn't comprehend. I could barely get out of bed for 2 weeks of every month. And yet they were, checking these things off their bucket list and making these advancements in their life stages. And I really believed for a long time that it's just because I wasn't trying hard enough. I didn't understand that other women weren't facing these challenges every single cycle. I put that burden and that weight on myself. I've since worked to untangle that and to use hindsight 2020 to rewrite the story and rewrite my understanding. But I want to name that all of that was true, that all of that happened for a very long time. And just like the 20-year statistic, I had symptom onset around 12, 13, and I wasn't diagnosed with PMDD until I was 28, and I didn't experience a symptom-free cycle until I was 29. First time ever. I didn't even know that was possible. I was just shocked that my period could come and I didn't move states or countries or end a relationship or quit a job. So here's what makes this even harder to untangle. For most of us experiencing PMDD, the years that are most active with symptoms, they're not random adult years. They are the years that shape everything. They're your adolescence and your early adulthood, the window when most people are building the foundation for their future, as I said. Figuring out who they are, developing relationships, establishing confidence, making choices that are going to compound positively over time instead of what I was experiencing. The Osborne researchers actually wrote about this directly. They noted that PMDD onset typically begins during adolescence. Now, it does not always. Okay, PMDD is just a constellation of symptoms. It doesn't tell you anything about the root cause, doesn't tell you anything about why it's happening or anything about what to do about it specifically for your body. And sometimes symptom onset happens later for women, that's true. But for many women, it does begin during adolescence. And that is really what this conversation is about today, like the heavy grief and the heavy holding of that truth is for those women. But if you have just recently started to experience symptoms and you haven't been experiencing them since adolescence, this is so hopeful for you because you don't have and you won't have the same complex trauma ultimately around the symptoms that a woman who has experienced these symptoms since adolescence and for decades has. But coming back to my point, the heaviest symptom times for many women are going to be during adolescence when it's a critical phase of life for identity formation, for building that foundation of life. And the women in their study had often absorbed their symptoms into their sense of self from a young age. They became the moody one, the unstable one, the one who couldn't hold it all together before they ever had a chance to figure out who they actually were. So let me rephrase that. When you've been experiencing symptoms since adolescence, according to the actual PMDD research, there is a wound on your identity formation where you merge with the symptom experience before you even have a chance to figure out who you actually are. This is being unwell during the years that build the adult. Okay? So let's take a breath here. Because it's heavy. Okay, we're going to turn around, but we gotta sit with the truth and the reality. Okay, and then there's the misdiagnosis layer, which adds its own kind of damage. A 2022 study in the Journal of Women's Health surveyed 192 women who were experiencing PMDD and found that they saw a median of 6 different healthcare providers before they got an accurate diagnosis. 6. That's not one bad doctor. It's the system failing over and over. And in the meantime, a lot of these women, like I was, were misdiagnosed. They were diagnosed with depression, anxiety, OCD, borderline personality disorder, bipolar, we can keep going, okay? And they were treated for those things. You may have spent years on medication that were simply targeting symptoms, but not the symptoms of your actual experience, and certainly not any root causes that were driving those symptoms. And so you internalize those labels. I internalized the label as a child that I was bipolar when I wasn't. That wasn't an accurate diagnosis. And you, like I, may have built an identity around being the person with a mood disorder or a personality disorder, when what you were actually experiencing was a hormonal condition that no one had never accurately named. So the misdiagnosed years, they're not just in the category of lost time, but they're time actively believing a false story, again, about who you are. And that's a common theme with PMDD. And it's really its own thing to grieve. So I mentioned it, but I was misdiagnosed as bipolar disorder when I was 16. And, I carried that label that I was given. I believed something was wrong with me. I believed that I was bipolar. I was going to be bipolar forever. There was nothing I could do but take this medication. And I believed a lot about myself because of that diagnosis, what I was capable of, who I was. And that's before we even get into me being treated with antipsychotics and having a pretty negative reaction to the side effects, which at the time I didn't realize were side effects from the medication, which then led to increased suicidal ideation, and on and on. I have a whole podcast episode on my story if you want to listen to that. We don't want to go down that rabbit hole here, but I do want to, shine a light on how not only the undiagnosed years, but the misdiagnosed years impacts your sense of self, your identity, that feeling stunted in life in so many ways. Whether it be from the actual symptoms or the treatment or the misdiagnosed label. I mean, are you following me here? It's like a rat's nest to untangle. It really is. Okay, so I want to give you one more number because it ties everything I just said together. A 2023 Stat Pearls review on PMDD cited research finding that women who are experiencing PMDD face an average of 6 days of severe symptoms per cycle. Multiply that across your reproductive life from adolescence to perimenopause, and the same review noted that it works out to roughly 8 years of debilitating symptoms over a lifetime. 8 years. And that's not just 8 years where things were a little harder. That's the equivalent to 8 full years of severe symptoms that disrupted 2 weeks at a time across decades that were supposed to be some of your best years. And having worked with thousands of women in the PMDD community and talked to even more, we generally see more than 6.4 days of severe symptoms mapped on our clients' symptom mapping data. Now, if you don't know how many days of symptoms you're experiencing or when they're happening, get our free symptom mapping kit, and that will help you suss that out. And that's really, really important, not only for an accurate diagnosis, but also for everything you try to do to reduce the symptoms. You need to be able to collect the symptoms daily, to see them visually play out across the cycle. You need to be able to gauge how every intervention that you're putting into place is impacting your symptoms. Now, had I known about this in those teenage years, I would have more quickly recognized that the antipsychotics were exacerbating my symptoms. They were worsening my symptoms. But I didn't have any system to track. I didn't have any education on what the side effects were to look out for. And these things happen slowly, and they often kind of merge with the symptoms you're already experiencing, so it can be hard to suss it all out. I also would have had the satisfaction of knowing that the protocols and the interventions I put into place were improving my symptoms by having that data. That's why we use it with our clients, because the story that you tell yourself is often louder than the truth. I cannot tell you, I'm sidebarring here, so hang with me, but I cannot tell you how many clients in our program will have reduced their symptoms by half. And they'll be like, yeah, I don't really feel that different, right? I don't know if it's really getting better. And then we look at the data and they have reclaimed 7 days, 10 days from moderate to severe symptoms. But that negativity bias and that story and that belief is so strong because the symptom days that were still there color everything else black. It's all they can see. So the data is really important. And this 8-year number from the 23 Stat Pearls review doesn't even account for the social or relational cost. A landmark paper by Hallbreck and colleagues published in Psychoneural Endocrinology found that the quality of life impact of PMDD is huge. They wrote PMDD substantially impaired social adjustment and a decrease in quality of life. I kind of roll my eyes because I'm like, we didn't need a study to know that, but great, fantastic that it's being looked at. So when you look back at the relationships that fractured, the jobs that didn't work out, the version of yourself you wanted to be and couldn't seem to actualize, all along you were carrying a condition with an impact that is comparable to chronic depression, but 2 weeks of every single cycle out of every 4. Now, I constantly say 2 weeks, even though, maybe your luteal phase isn't 2 weeks. I feel like it's the best reference because there's not just the days that you're actively experiencing moderate to severe symptoms. There's the fear that you're living with before the luteal phase comes. What's going to happen this cycle? What am I going to ruin? Who am I going to have to apologize to? There's fear. There's so much fear. Then you're surviving the active cycle days that are moderate to severe. Then you're recovering afterward, picking up the pieces, catching up, putting your life back together, depending on how severe the episodes were. So I say 2 weeks, but I'm being conservative there in my estimation because it may be more, and it often is for our clients. So there's one more piece of research that I want to put on the table here because I think it explains so much, and it's a 2024 systemic review in Archives of Women's Health, which pulled data from 27 studies on trauma exposure and PMDD, and they found that 61% of women experiencing PMDD had a trauma history. And women with PMDD were nearly twice as likely, 1.99 times, more likely to report a trauma history than women without PMDD. Now, we're not saying trauma solely causes PMDD or PMDD is a trauma response, but there's some stuff to unpack there, and we'll do an episode on that. And the research doesn't say that, but it does say there's a huge trauma overlap between huge overlap between PMDD and trauma, and the trauma is one of the root causes of PMDD. And that years of unmanaged luteal symptoms on top of whatever you were already carrying because of the trauma history compound the weight of what you've been holding. This isn't even to mention the complex trauma that can come from feeling like you're losing your mind for 2 weeks of every cycle, or the tragic relationship dismantling that happens, or the firing from jobs, or XYZ. I mean, we could just keep going, right? But again, this is not a fundamental flaw in who you are. This again is just pointing back to the body and nervous system being under a tremendous load. And very few of you understand that yourself, and definitely no one probably in your life understands. So another statistic I want to name here, because it does also matter for context, a 2020 study by Eisenlohr Moll. I'm probably saying her name wrong. Her name's Tori. She's a prominent PMDD researcher. Shout out to Tori. But her and her colleagues published in BMC Psychiatry, surveying nearly 600 women with PMDD, and they found that 72% had experienced lifetime active suicidal thoughts, 49% made a specific plan, and 34% had actually attempted suicide. That's heavy. We're getting heavy here, but I want to say it because if you've lived those numbers, if you've had those thoughts, and you've never told anyone about it, I want you to know that this is a symptom of PMDD. It's not who you are. It's not a character flaw. It's not because you're broken. It's a symptom of a serious reproductive hormonal mood condition that has not been diagnosed properly, has not been managed properly. And if you're in that place right now, please get help. Please get help, right? There's a suicide hotline, 988. There's licensed counselors. There's plenty of support for you out there. You don't have to continue to white knuckle it, but we do have to continue to share those stats so you know, because I can't tell you how many people are feeling these things and thinking these thoughts and not seeing it for what it is, a symptom. They're seeing it and believing it. My family would be better off without me. I felt that way. Did a podcast episode on this topic with my dad. He cried, I cried. Have you listened to it? It's on the podcast. I can't remember what episode it is, but it's back there. And we have to continue to scream those stats from the rooftop, continue to help you create distance from those thoughts between who you are, continue to see them for what they are, which is not the truth, but simply a symptom of PMDD. And if this was your past, if you've been experiencing PMDD since adolescence, you've been navigating through those dark luteal weeks and nobody knew about it, I really want you to hold all of this as evidence of how hard you have been fighting, even when you didn't know what you were up against, you know? So what happens when you finally get the answers? In truth, it's not immediate relief. For a lot of women, it's grief. Big, complicated, heavy emotions, more of them. You know, do we need more of that? We do, it turns out. And I want to be honest about that because I don't think the PMDD community is honest about it. Really, there's very few women sharing stories of symptom success. It's why we advocate for women in our program to share their stories, even though it's scary and so vulnerable, and very few of them choose to do it. But I can shout from the rooftops all day about how it's possible for you to reduce and manage your symptoms. But you need to hear from women who are doing it too, other than me. And, you know, you're not seeing that in the PMDD community. There's very little hope. There's a lot of desperation. There's a lot of suffering. And I've been there, but we are trying to lay out a different path of possibility for you. So there is a version of your story that goes, you find the root cause, first it's going to go, you find the accurate diagnosis, then you dive into the root causes, you do the work to support the root causes, you feel better, and your life gets more beautiful. And that's true. But there's another part that no one is going to tell you. And I tell all of our clients this when they graduate out and when they're in the program. You know, when you start to feel better, when the luteal weeks get lighter, you can think more clearly. You start to get days back that used to be spent surviving at all costs, you know. You start to see your life and your past differently when you start to get that time back. You see it clearly, maybe for the first time. And what you see is how sick you are. You can't know how sick you are until you feel better, okay? And grief comes with that. You start to see how much you were truly managing, how much of your energy went into just surviving every single cycle that could have gone somewhere else. And you start to see more clearly what your life might have looked like if someone had caught this, accurately diagnosed it. You would have looked into the root causes. You would have reduced and managed the symptoms earlier at, say, 14, 15, 16, 17. I mean, my life would be, I don't even know, unrecognizable. It's unrecognizable now than it was 8 years ago. So think about if that would have happened any time over the 17 years that I was undiagnosed or misdiagnosed. And that clarity is a gift. It is. But it is also a gut punch, okay? There's the duality of truth happening here. The paradox of reality. It's all there. You grieve the relationships that could have been different. the version of yourself who might have had more confidence or more stability or capacity to show up, the opportunities that came and went when your symptoms were really challenging, and the years of believing a false story about who you are. You grieve that. But that grief isn't a sign that something's wrong with the work you're doing. It's a sign of how far you've come, because you can't grieve something you can't see. And you can't see it clearly until you start to get far enough away from it. So much of what we do in our one-to-one program is to create distance between the symptoms and the experience and who you are as a person, right? Our framework, I've talked about this multiple times, we shift you from seeing PMDD as the problem, from seeing yourself as the problem, and then taking random action out of that because you're reacting, you're in survival mode, and you're not getting where you want to go. It's a dead end. You're just running on a treadmill over and over, not getting where you want to go. We shift that to see PMDD for what it is, a challenge, and the symptoms are a challenge that you are going to face. How does that feel different when I say you're a problem, your PMDD symptoms are a problem, and then I say, no, the PMDD symptoms are a challenge, and the PMDD symptoms are a challenge that you're facing? Probably feels pretty different in your body when you hear me say both of those things. When you say those two things to yourself, they're going to feel very different. But you can't just make that one shift and then go from challenge to action. We have to build understanding next. Then we need awareness. Then we get to the juiciest part, which is you have agency. For once, you have agency, which is what you really want. You really want agency. And then you can take aligned action, and that path charts a totally different reality than the problem reaction path that you've been on. Shifting from problem reaction to challenge, awareness, understanding, agency, aligned action. Okay? The other thing that nobody tells you is that feeling behind doesn't just disappear when you finally get the accurate diagnosis or when you start experiencing symptom relief. You can look back and know exactly what happened in retrospect with hindsight 2020 and still wake up feeling behind everyone else. I actually did a story on this a couple of weeks ago about how I feel stunted as a human being, as an adult, because of the 17 years of undiagnosed and misdiagnosed symptoms. Even now, I still feel that way. I still feel like I'm playing catch up in my career, in some of my relationships, in my sense of self, absolutely. And I still feel like there are whole rooms inside of myself that never got fully built because of the symptoms. And you probably feel like that too. And that feeling is real and true, but it's not the full truth, not the full reality. Because the undiagnosed and misdiagnosed PMDD years, those stunted years, as I kind of refer to them as, even while they were costing you, you built a resilience that most people will never understand. You built an ability to function through challenges that would knock most people flat on their faces. You built capacity for empathy, specifically for people who are experiencing suffering in ways that don't show up on the outside. And you built awareness for your own internal landscape that most people never develop because they never have to. And those years were not entirely lost. They were survival. And survival builds things too, even when part of us is telling us the story that it doesn't, but it does. It really does. You know, those hard years taught me how to lean on community and how to ask for help and how to continue advocating for myself. They taught me that I had more determination and reserve than I believed possible because I am still here, right? They taught me how to ask better questions, how to dig deeper, how to not minimize pain and suffering and loss, right? The survival years really taught me how to hold the two truths, the cost and the unexpected things that it gave me. It gave me purpose. It gave me gratitude. It gave me so much. it taught me how to care for myself so that I could learn to reduce and better manage symptoms, which then helped me build a beautiful and unrecognizable life from 8 years ago. But it's still hard to see. It's still hard to see. It's still hard to hold the true truths. But that awareness is the first step. Well, really the first step is switching from problem to challenge, as I said. But you can't even do that if you don't understand, if you don't have the awareness of what's happening. So it's not the only step, as I said. There are 5 steps. It's not a magic door that makes everything rainbows and butterflies forever. But we need the first step. Because you can't reclaim years if you don't understand what's happening and what was already lost. You can't build what comes next without knowing why the foundation was cracked in the first place. You can't stop running that old story that's perpetuating your beliefs about yourself, which then perpetuates your behaviors, which then builds your life, right? The story that you're lazy, that you're difficult, that you're too emotional, until you know where that story came from. And the diagnosis is a part of that. The root cause exploration is a part of that. The agency is a part of that. It's really where reclaiming starts. It's slow, it's not linear, and you're still grieving along the way, and that's allowed. Right now I'm still in that process, 8 years after having my first symptom-free period that I didn't even know was possible to happen. Part of feeling so stunted and behind in life is that I was telling myself a story that I just wasn't trying hard enough. I was 27, people around me were getting their doctorate degrees, they were getting married, having children, buying homes, and I could barely get out of bed for 2 weeks of every cycle. I didn't know that everyone wasn't just trying to survive their cycle. I didn't know that, right? It just wasn't something that's talked about. It's talked about more now. But this was many years ago, and there wasn't a lot of talk about your period, and I didn't even know that my symptoms were tied to my period, right? I would get so immersed in the symptom experience that even though my mom took me to the gynecologist at age 14 and said her period is making her crazy, I could never connect the dots for so long because I would get sucked into just the deep self-loathing and pain, physically and emotionally, that I kind of forgot every single time. I had the PMDD amnesia every single time that, here it is again, and then it would go away and I would forget that it's going to come back. But I really internalized it as that I was fundamentally flawed. And that's why I couldn't keep up and I wasn't farther along in my life and I couldn't maintain relationships or have a career or go back to school or anything. And even 8 years into having reduced and better managed symptoms, I still go through grief waves of what was lost, of what has changed, of what I can see now at year 8 that I couldn't see at year 2. And really, what I'm learning is what it feels like to be someone who understands what happened to her in her life, right? And it really led me, the hard version really led me to a hopeful version. And both can be true at the same time. So before I get to the takeaway, one quick favor to ask. If this episode is resonating with you, please take 2 seconds to support the show. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the like button and subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And if you're listening on a podcast app, please leave a rating or review. It takes less than a minute and it makes a huge difference in getting this information in front of the women who need it most. Okay, back to it. So what I do not want you to walk away with is I do not want you to sit in the grief of the lost years and stop there. Because the same math that tells you what PMDD has cost you also tells you what is still possible. If you start reducing and better managing your symptoms today, the research and what we see In our nutritional therapy practice, both point in the same direction. Severe hormonal mood symptoms can shrink in number. Luteal weeks can stop being 2 weeks of full wipeouts. And your functional impairment that has been costing you days and weeks every single cycle can change and can come down significantly. In our practice, we track metrics of success, and our clients reclaim an average of 11 days per cycle from moderate to severe symptoms. That's roughly half of their month that's returned back to them. We also see a 46% reduction in their symptom burden and a 47% improvement in their quality of life. Now, I just want you to sit with that for a second, because this is possible for you. Those 6.4 days of severe symptoms per cycle that the research described, for a lot of the women that we work with, those days are not just shrinking, they're being replaced with functional, present, engaged days. Days where they work or they start working again, where they parent, they show up in their relationships, and they show up for themselves. So we actually built a free tool to help you do this. It's on our website at hermoodmentor.com. Go to the homepage, scroll down to find the PMDD symptom calculator, and see how much time you can get back for your goals and your future. Okay, so you're going to enter how many days you're suffering from moderate to severe symptoms each cycle, how old you currently are, and then what the expected age of menopause is. The average age in the United States is 51, so you can just enter 51. Or if you know that your mother and grandmother have earlier or later dates, that's a good date range to plug in. That's going to be more accurate to you specifically. You plug that number in, and it's going to calculate for free how much time you could get back until that expected age of menopause. The link is in the show notes. Go run your number. And I think it will reframe the math for you in a way that just the grief alone cannot, because we need to pair the truth and the hope with the grief. So here's what I want to leave you with. If you're listening to this and feeling that grief and that ache for the years that you lost due to symptoms, the relationships that suffered, the version of yourself you were supposed to be, please know something. The fact that you can feel that grief is actually a signpost of how far you've come. You could not have felt that grief when you were deep in survival mode and you had no name for what you were going through. You're here on the PMDD Pep Talk podcast because you know about PMDD. You maybe even have a diagnosis. You could not have sat with that grief during every luteal phase week that you were in crisis and just trying to get through. The grief means that you're far enough out of the worst of it to finally see it. Right? You're not going to see the grief when you're surviving it. So we do need to mourn it. We do need to give it the weight that it deserves, but it's not a step back when we do that. This is actually what reclaiming your life from symptoms looks like. It's not all rainbows and butterflies all the time. Sometimes it's sitting with the loss of what happened and letting that be real, and then turning toward what is still ahead. We have to hold the two truths. We have to work to heal. You know, we talk about healing a lot on this podcast, and it does not mean never having a symptom or never having a bad day again. What the etymology of healing actually is to become whole with your experience. And to become whole, you have to have the darkness, you have to have the light. That is the truth. So you are not behind. You're here now having this conversation with me. You're awake to your own story in a way that most people never get to be. And that really matters, okay? You're not at zero. You're not starting at zero. You're starting from your experience, and you still have more time ahead of you than the grief lets you believe. The negativity bias with PMDD is so strong. It's why so much of our program is built on subtly rewiring it throughout the program. And there are times when we're graduating a client out who feels just like, yeah, I don't know, like it's a little bit better. And then we look at their mapping data and they have reclaimed 7+ days of symptoms, right? So that mapping data is really important because the stories that your PMDD brain are telling you are not going to be the truth. You need the data. You need to be able to look at your symptom mapping and see, as you implement different interventions, different protocols, what is actually happening. You need that for yourself so you can look back at that and see the truth. That rewriting that negativity bias takes time. It takes repetition because it has been built over time and over repetition. Just like laying a new path in the yard when you're digging up the sod and you're laying down the path and then you're fighting the sod from growing over the path. It's just like that. The neural pathways, the myelin sheaths, you have to lay a new one, and it requires repetition and it requires seeing on the page what is happening. So if you haven't started symptom mapping, it is the first place after you reframe to PMDD being a problem and you being a problem to challenge. Then you start collecting the symptoms in a visual format and building awareness around what is happening with your symptoms when. Then you can start understanding them. Then you can start building in that agency to take aligned action. So thank you for being here with me today. Thank you for having this backdoor pep talk and getting into the grief. It's really something I've been wanting to name. Like I said, we're getting a lot of messages from women naming this, and I wanted to have a full conversation on it from the perspective of working with thousands of women, from the perspective of living with this undiagnosed and misdiagnosed for 17 years, and then from the perspective of being a practitioner in this space for the last 8 years and personally reduced and better managing my symptoms over the last 8 years of, what this looks like, what these two truths, the grief and the hope for your future are, and to encourage you to hold both of them and stop giving so much weight to the grief, stop living in so much fear of what's being lost, and start directing your attention and your energy towards changing your story.